Side 2, Isle of the Dead, continuing on page 57. Then beauty is guilty, he said. God damn it. Beauty as an abstract principle? Yes. And in individual objects? Yes. That's ridiculous. Guilt requires responsibility, some kind of intent. Beauty's responsible. Have another beer. He did, and belched again. Take a look at that good-looking guy over at the bar, he said. That guy trying to pick up the broad in the green dress. Somebody's going to bust him one in the nose sometime. It wouldn't have to happen if he was ugly. Nick later proved his point by busting the guy one in the nose, because he'd called him Shorty. So maybe there was something to what he said. Nick was around 4 feet tall. He had the shoulders and arms of a powerful athlete. He could beat anybody I knew at wrist wrestling. He had a normal-sized head, too, full of blond hair and beard, with a couple blue eyes above a busted nose that turned off to the right, and a mean smile that usually revealed only half a dozen of his yellow-stained teeth. He was all gnarled below the waist. He'd come from a family lousy with professional soldiers. His father had been a general, and all of his brothers and sisters, except for one, were officers in something or other. Nick had grown up in an environment alive with the martial arts. Any weapon you cared to name, he could operate it. He could fence, shoot, ride, set explosive charges, break boards and necks with his hands, live off the land, and fail any physical examination in the galaxy because he was a dwarf. I'd hired him as a game hunter to kill off my experiments that went bad. He hated beautiful things and things that were bigger than he was. What I think is beautiful and what you think is beautiful, I said, might disgust a Rigelian, and vice versa. Therefore, beauty is a relative thing, so you can't condemn it as an abstract principle if... Crap, he said. So they hurt, rape, steal, and screw themselves up over different things. It's still because beauty sits there, demanding violation. Then how can you blame an individual object? We do business with Rigelians, don't we? Yes. Then it can be translated. Enough said. Then the good-looking guy at the bar who'd been trying to pick up the broad in the green dress passed by on his way to the men's room and called Nick Shorty when he asked him to move his chair out of the way. That ended our evening in that bar. Nick swore he'd die with his boots on some exotic safari, but he found his Kilimanjaro in a hospital on Earth, where they'd cured everything that was bothering him, except for the galloping pneumonia he'd picked up in the hospital. That had been roughly 250 years ago. I'd been a pallbearer. I mashed out my cigarette and made my way back to the slip sled. Whatever was rotten in me, I'd find it out later. It was time to go. The dead are too much with us. For 2 weeks I puzzled over what I'd found, and I kept myself fit. When I entered the Home Free system, my life was further complicated by the fact that Home Free had picked up an additional satellite. Not a natural one, either. "What the hell!" exclamation I sent ahead in code. "Visitor," came the reply. "Landing permission requested. Stop. Denied. Stop. Still circling. Stop. Says he's an Earth intelligence man. Stop." "Let him land," I said. "Half an hour after I'm down. Stop." There came the acknowledgement, and I swung into a tight orbit and pushed the Model T down and around and down. After a frolic with the beasts, I repaired to my home for a shower, shucked my Connor face, then dressed for dinner. It would appear that something finally meant enough to the wealthiest government in existence for someone to at last authorize a trip on the part of some underpaid civil servant in one of the cheapest interstellar vehicles available. I vowed to at least feed him well. Chapter 3. Louis Briggs and I regarded one another across the remains of dinner and the wide table they occupied. His identification papers informed me that he was an agent of Earth's Central Intelligence Department. He looked like a shaved monkey. He was a wizened little guy with a perpetually inquisitive stare, and it seemed as if he must be pushing retirement age. He'd stuttered just a bit when he'd introduced himself, but the dinner appeared to have relaxed him, and the falter had halted. "It was a very pleasant meal, Mr. Sandow," he acknowledged. "Now, if I may, I'd like to discuss the business that brought me here." "Then let's adjourn to the upstairs, where we can get some fresh air while we talk." We arose, taking our drinks with us, and I led him to the elevator. 5 seconds later, it admitted us to the roof garden, and I gestured toward a couple lounging chairs set beneath a chestnut tree. "How about there?" I asked. He nodded and seated himself. A cool breeze came out of the twilight, and we breathed it in and gave it back. "It's quite impressive," he said, looking around the garden shadows, "the way you satisfy your every whim." "This particular whim in which we're relaxing," I said, "is landscaped to make this place virtually undetectable by means of aerial reconnaissance." "Oh, the thought hadn't occurred to me." I offered him a cigar, which he declined, so I lit it for myself and asked him, "So what is it you want of me?" "Will you consent to accompany me back to Earth and talk to my chief?" he asked. "No," I said. "I've answered that question a dozen times in as many letters. Earth grates on my nerves. It gives me a big pain these days. That's why I live out here. Earth is overcrowded, bureaucratic, unhealthy, and suffering from too many mass psychoses to bother classifying. Whatever your chief wants to say, you can say for him, and I'll answer you, and you can take it back to him." "Normally," he said, "these matters are handled at the division level." "Sorry about that," I replied, "but I'll foot the bill for a coded couriergram from here if it comes to that." "The reply would cost the department too much," he said. "Our budget, you know." "For Christ's sake, I'll pay it both ways, then. Anything to stop cluttering my incoming basket with what is still strangely referred to as surface carrier mail." "God, no!" A tone of panic clung to his words. "It's never been done before, and the man-hours involved in determining how to bill you would be prohibitive." Inwardly, I wept for thee, Mother Earth, and the prodigies that had been wrought upon thee. The government is born, it flourishes, strong as its nationalism and great its frontiers. Then comes a time of solidification, division of labor unto specialization, and the layers of management and chains of command. Yes, and Max Weber spoke of this. He saw bureaucracy in the necessary evolution of all institutions, and he saw that it was good. He saw that it was necessary and good. While it may be necessary, put a comma after that word, and after the last one add God and an exclamation point. For there comes a time in the history of all bureaucracies when they must inevitably parody their own functions. Look what the breakup of the big Austro-Hungarian machine did to poor Kafka, or the Russian one to Gogol. It drove them out of their cotton-picking minds, poor bastards, and now I was looking at a man who had survived an infinitely more inscrutable one until the end of his days was in sight. This indicated to me that he was slightly below average intelligence, emotionally handicapped, insecure, or morally suspect, or else he was an iron-willed masochist. For these neuter machines, combining as they do the worst of both father image and mother image, that is, the security of the womb and the authority of an omniscient leader, always manage to attract the nebbish. And this is why, Mother Earth, I wept inwardly for thee at that moment of the immense parade called time. The clowns are passing, and everybody knows that inside, somewhere, their hearts are broken. "Then tell me what you would like of me, and I'll answer you now," I said. He reached into his inside pocket and withdrew a sealed envelope bearing various security stamps, which I didn't bother examining too closely even when he handed it to me. "Should you not consent to accompany me back to Earth, I was instructed to deliver this to you." "If I had agreed to go along, what would you have done with it?" "Returned it to my chief," he said. "So that he could hand it to me?" "Probably," he said. I tore it open and withdrew a single sheet of paper. I held it close and squinted through the dim light. It was a list of 6 names. I kept my face under control as I read them. They were all names of people I had loved or hated, and they were each of them, somewhere, the subject of a moldering obituary. Also, they had all figured prominently in some recent photography I had been called upon to witness. I puffed smoke, refolded the list, replaced it in the envelope, and dropped it on the table between us. "What does it signify?" I asked, after a time. "They are all potentially alive," he said. "I request that you destroy the list at your earliest convenience." "Okay," I said. "And why are they potentially alive?" "Because their recall tapes were stolen." "How?" "We don't know." "Why?" "We don't know that either." And you came to me because you are the only link we could find. You knew all of them well. My first reaction was disbelief, but I concealed it and said nothing. Recall tapes are the one thing in the universe which I had always considered inviolate, unreachable, for the 30 days of their existence, and then they were gone forever. I tried to get hold of one once and failed. Their guardians were incorruptible, their vaults impenetrable. And this was part of another reason why I don't visit Earth much anymore. I don't like the idea of wearing a recall plate, even temporarily. Persons born there have them implanted at birth, and they are required by law to wear them for as long as they remain on Earth. Persons moving to Earth for purposes of residing there are required to have them installed. Even a visitor must bear one for the duration of his stay. What they do is monitor the electromagnetic matrix of the nervous system. They record the shifting patterns of a man's being, and each is as unique as a fingerprint. Their one function is to transmit that final pattern at the moment of death. Death is the trigger, the shot is the psyche that targets a machine. It's an enormous machine, and it records that transmission on a strip of tape you can hold in the palm of your hand. All that a man ever was or hoped to be, weighing less than an ounce. After 30 days, the tape is destroyed. That's it. In a small and classified number of cases over the past several centuries, however, that wasn't it. The purpose for the whole strange and costly setup is this. There are some individuals who, dying suddenly on the planet Earth at crucial points in significant lives, depart this lachrymose valley with information vital to the economy/technology/national interest of Earth. The whole recall system is there for the purpose of retrieving such data. Even the mighty machine is not sufficiently sophisticated to draw this information from the recorded matrix, however. That is why every wearer of the plate has a frozen tissue culture somewhere. This culture is associated with a tape and held for 30 days subsequent to death, and both are normally destroyed together. Should recall be necessary, an entire new body is grown from the culture in an AGT, that's an accelerated growth tank. And this body duplicates the original in all things, save that its brain is a tabula rasa. On this clean plate, then, is superimposed the recorded matrix, so that the recalled individual possesses every thought and memory which existed in the original up until the moment of death. He is then in a position to supply the information which the entire World Congress has deemed to be of sufficient value to warrant recall. An ironclad security setup guards the entire system, which is housed in a quarter-mile square fortress in Dallas. "Do you think I stole the tapes?" I asked. He crossed and uncrossed his legs, looked away. "You'll admit there's a pattern, and that it seems somehow related to you?" "Yes, but I didn't do it." "You'll admit that you were investigated and charged at one time for attempting to bribe a government official in order to obtain the tape for your first wife, Catherine?" "It's a matter of public record, so I can't deny it. But the charges were dismissed," I said. "True, because you could afford a lot of bad publicity and good lawyers, and you hadn't succeeded in obtaining the tape anyway. It was later stolen, though, and it was years before we discovered that it hadn't been destroyed on the scheduled date. There was no way of linking it to you, or of obtaining jurisdiction in the place you were then residing. There was no other way of reaching you, either." I smiled at his accent on the word reaching. I, too, have a security network. "And what do you think I would have done with the tape had I obtained it?" "You're a wealthy man, Mr. Sandow, one of the few who could afford to duplicate the machinery necessary for recall, and your training—" "I'll admit I once had that in mind. Unfortunately, I didn't obtain the tape, so the attempt was never made." "Then how do you explain the others? The subsequent thefts which occurred over several centuries, always involving friends or enemies of yours?" "I don't have to explain," I said, "because I don't owe you an explanation for anything I do. But I will tell you this. I didn't do it. I don't have the tapes, never had them. I had no idea up until now that they were missing." But, good Lord, they were the 6. "Then, accepting that is true for the moment," he said, "can you supply us with any sort of lead as to who might have had sufficient interest in these people to go to such extremes?" "I cannot," I said, seeing the Isle of the Dead in my mind's eye, and knowing that I would have to find out. "I feel I should point out," said Briggs, "that this case will never be closed on our books until we have been satisfied as to the disposition of the tapes." "I see," I said. "Would you mind telling me how many unclosed cases you're carrying on your books at the present time?" "The number is unimportant," he said. "It's the principle involved. We never give up." "It's just that I heard there were quite a few," I said, "and that some of them are getting pretty moldy." "I take it you won't cooperate?" "Not won't. Can't. I don't have anything to give you." "And you won't return to Earth with me?" "To hear your chief repeat everything you've just said to me? No, thanks. Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I'd help if I could, but I don't see any way I can." "All right. I guess I'll be leaving then. Thanks for the dinner." He rose. "You might as well stay overnight," I said, "and get a decent night's sleep in a comfortable bed before you shove off." He shook his head. "Thanks, but I can't. I'm on per diem, and I have to account for all the time I spend on a job." "How do they calculate per diem when you're in subspace?" "It's complicated," he said. So I waited for the mailman. He's a big fax machine who picks up messages beamed to home free and turns them into letters and gives them to S&F, who sorts them and drops them into my basket. While I waited, I made my preparations for the visit to Illyria. I'd followed Briggs every step of the way. I'd seen him to his vessel and monitored its departure from my system. I supposed I might see him again one day, or his chief, if I found out what had really happened and made it back home. It was obvious that whoever wanted me on Illyria had not set the thing up for purposes of throwing a party on my behalf. That's why my preparations mainly involved the selection of weapons. As I picked and chose from among the smaller of the deadlies in my arsenal, I thought some thoughts of recall. Briggs had been right, of course. Only a wealthy man could afford to duplicate the expensive recall equipment housed in Dallas. Some research would be involved, too, for a few of the techniques were still classified. I sought candidates from among my competitors. Douglas? No. He hated me, but he wouldn't go to such elaborate ends to nail me if he ever decided it was worthwhile. Crowson. He'd do it if he could, but I kept him under such close surveillance that I was certain he hadn't had the opportunity for anything of this magnitude. The Lady Coyle of Rigel. Virtually senile by now. Her daughters ran her empire and wouldn't humor such an expensive request for revenge, I was sure. Who then? I checked my records, and they didn't show recent transactions. So I sent a couriergram to the Central Registration Unit for that stellar district. Before the answer came back, however, I received Marling's reply to my message from Driscoll. "Come to Megapay immediately," it said. And that was all. None of the formal flourishes characteristic of pay-in writing style were present. Only that single, bald statement. It was the keynote of urgency. Either Marling was worse off than he'd suspected, or my query had struck something big. I arranged for CRU's message to be forwarded to me in Megapay, Megapay, Megapay. And then I was gone. Chapter 4. Megapay. If you're going to pick a place to die, you might as well pick a comfortable one. The Payans did, and I consider them wise. It had been a pretty desolate place, I am told, when they found it, but they refurbished it before they moved in and settled down to the business of dying. Megapay's around 7,000 miles through the middle, with 2 big continents in the northern hemisphere and 3 small ones to the south. The larger of the northern ones looks like a tall teapot tilted to pour, the handle broken at the top, and the other resembles an ivy leaf from which some hungry caterpillar took a big northwestern bite. These 2 are about 800 miles apart, and the bottom of the ivy leaf dips about 5 degrees into the tropic zone. The teapot is around the size of Europe. The 3 continents in the southern hemisphere look like continents, that is to say, irregular chunks of green and gray surrounded by a cobalt sea, and they don't remind me of anything else. Then there's lots of little islands and a few fairly large ones scattered all about the globe. The ice caps are small and keep pretty much to themselves. The temperature is pleasant, as the ecliptic and the equator are fairly close. The continents all possess bright beaches and peaceful mountains, and any pleasant habitation you care to imagine somewhere in between. The Payans had wanted it that way. There are no large cities, and the city of Megapay on the continent of Megapay, there on Megapay, is therefore not a large city. Megapay the continent is the chomped ivy leaf. Megapay the city lies on the sea in the middle of the chump. No two habitations within the city are nearer than a mile from one another. I orbited twice, because I wanted to look down and admire that handiwork. I still couldn't spot a single feature which I'd have cared to change. They were my masters when it came to the old art, always would be. Memories poured back of the gone happy days before I'd become rich and famous and hated. The population of the entire world was less than 1 million. I could probably lose myself down there, as once I had, and dwell on Megapay for the rest of my days. I knew I wouldn't. Not yet, anyhow. But sometimes it's pleasant to daydream. On my second pass I entered the atmosphere, and after a time the wind sang about me, and the sky changed from indigo to violet to a deep, pure azure, with little wisps of cirrus hovering there between being and nothingness. The stretch on which I landed was practically Marling's backyard. I secured the ship and walked toward his tower, carrying a small suitcase. It was about a mile's distance. As I walked the familiar trail shaded by broadleaf trees, I whistled once, lightly, and a bird call mimicked my note. I could smell the sea, though I could not yet view it. All was as it had been years before, in the days when I had set myself the impossible task and gone forth to wrestle the gods, hoping only for forgetfulness, finding something far different. Memories, like stained slides, suddenly became illuminated as I encountered successively an enormous mossed-over boulder, a giant parton tree, a cribble, an almost lavender greyhound-like creature the size of a small horse, with long lashes and a crown of rosy quills, which bounded quickly away, a yellow sail, when the sea came into view. Then Marling's pier down in the cove, and finally the tower itself, entire, mauve, serene, severe and high, above the splashing below the sunward skies, clean as a tooth, and far, far older than I. I ran the last 100 yards and banged upon the grillwork that covered the arched way into the small courtyard. After perhaps 2 minutes, a strange young Payan came and stood and regarded me from the other side. I spoke to him in Payan. I said, "My name is Francis Sandow, and I have come to see Dra Marling." At this, the Payan unlatched the gate and held it open. Not until I had entered, for such is their custom, did he answer. "You are welcome, Dra Sandow. Dra Marling will see you after the tidal bell has rung. Let me show you to a place of rest and bring you refreshment." I thanked him and followed him up the winding stair. I ate a light meal in the chamber to which he had conducted me. I still had more than an hour until the turning of the tide, so I lit a cigarette and stared out over the ocean through that wide, low window beside the bed, my elbows upon the sill that was harder than intermetallized plastic, and gray. Strange to live like this, you say. A race capable of damn near anything? A man named Marling capable of building worlds? Maybe. Marling could have been wealthier than Boehner and I put together and multiplied by 10 had he chosen. But he'd picked a tower on a cliff overlooking the sea, a forest at his back, and he decided to live there till he died, and was doing it. I will trace no morals, such as a drawing away from the over-civilized races who are flooding the galaxy, such as repugnance for any society at all, even that of one's fellows. Anything would be an oversimplification. He was there because he wanted to be there, and I cannot go behind the fact. Still, we are kindred spirits, Marling and I, despite the differences in our fortresses. He saw that before I did, though how he could tell that the power might dwell in the broken alien who turned up on his doorstep one day, centuries before, is something that I do not understand. Sick of wandering, frightened by time, I had gone to seek counsel of what was said to be the oldest race around. How frightened I had become, I find it hard to describe. To see everything die. I don't think you know what it's like. But that's why I went to Megapay. Shall I tell you a little of myself? Why not? I told me again, as I waited for the bell. I was born on the planet Earth into the middle of the 20th century, that period in the history of the race when man succeeded in casting off many of the inhibitions and taboos laid upon him by tradition, reveled for a brief time, and then discovered that it didn't make a bloody bit of difference that he had. He was still just as dead when he died, and he still was faced with every life-death problem that had confronted him before, compounded by the fact that Malthus was right. I left my indefinite college major at the end of my sophomore year to enlist in the Army, along with my younger brother, who was just out of high school. That's how I found Tokyo Bay. Afterwards, I returned to school for a degree in engineering, decided that was a mistake, returned again to pick up the requirements for medical school. Somewhere along the line, I got sidetracked by the life sciences, went on for a master's in biology, kept pursuing a growing interest in ecology. I was 26 years old, and the year was 1991. My father had died, and my mother had remarried. I had fallen for a girl, proposed to her, been rebuffed, volunteered for one of the first attempts to reach another star system. My mixed academic background got me passage, and I was frozen for a century's voyage. We made it to Burton, began setting up a colony. Before a year's time, however, I was stricken by a local disease for which we lacked a cure, not to mention a name. I was then refrozen in my cold bunker to await some eventual therapy. 22 years later, I came around. There had been 8 more shiploads of colonists, and a new world lay about me. 4 more shiploads arrived that same year, and only 2 would remain. The other 2 were going on to a more distant system, to join an even newer colony. I got passage by trading places with a colonist who chickened out on the second leg of the flight. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, or so I thought, and since I could no longer recall the face, let alone the name, of the girl who had caused me to make the initial move, my desire to go on was predicated, I am certain, solely upon curiosity and the fact that the environment in which I then found myself had already been somewhat tamed, and I had had no part in its taming. It took a century and a quarter of cold sleep to reach the world we then sought, and I didn't like the place at all. That's why I signed up for a long haul, after only 8 months, a 276-year journey out to Bifrost, which was to be man's farthest outpost, if we could make a go of it. Bifrost was bleak and bitter and scared me, and convinced me that maybe I wasn't meant to be a colonist. I made one more trip to get away, and it was already too late. People were suddenly all over the place. Intelligent aliens were contacted. Interstellar trips were matters of weeks and months, not centuries. Funny? I thought so. I thought it was a great joke. Then it was pointed out to me that I was possibly the oldest man alive, doubtless the only survivor of the 20th century. They told me about the Earth. They showed me pictures. Then I didn't laugh any more, because Earth had become a different world. I was suddenly very alone. Everything I had learned in school seemed medieval. So what did I do? I went back to see for myself. I returned to school, discovered I could still learn. I was scared, though, all the time. I felt out of place. Then I heard of the one thing that might give me a wedge in the times, the one thing that might save me the feeling of being the last survivor of Atlantis walking down Broadway. The one thing that might make me superior to the strange world in which I found myself. I heard of the Payans, a then recently discovered race to whom all the marvels of the 27th century on Earth, including the treatments which had added a couple centuries to my life expectancy, would seem like ancient history. So I came to Megapay. Half out of my mind, picked a tower at random, called out at the gate till someone responded, then said, "Teach me, please." I had gone to the Tower of Marling, all unknowing at the time, Marling of the 26 names that lived. When the tidal bell rang, the young Payan came for me, and he conducted me up the winding stair to the top. He stepped into the room, and I heard Marling's voice greet him. "Dra Sandow is here to see you," he replied. "Then bid him enter." The young Payan returned through the door and said, "He bids you enter." "Thank you." I went in. Merling was seated with his back to me, facing out the window toward the sea, as I knew he would be. The 3 large walls of his fan-shaped chamber were a pale green, resembling jade, and his bed was long, low, and narrow. One wall was an enormous console, somewhat dusty. and the small bedside table, which might not have been moved in centuries, still held the orange figurine resembling a horned dolphin leaping. "Dra, good afternoon," I said. "Come over here where I can see you." I rounded his chair and stood before him. He was thinner, and his skin was darker. "You came quickly," he said, his eyes moving across my face. I nodded. "You said immediately." He made a hissed, rattling sound, which is a paean chuckle then. "How have you been treating life?" "With respect, deference, and fear." "What of your work?" "I'm between jobs just now." "Sit down." He indicated a bench alongside the window, and I crossed to it. "Tell me what has happened." "Pictures," I said. "I've been receiving pictures of people I used to know, people who have been dead for some time now. All of them died on Earth, and I recently learned that their recall tapes were stolen. So it's possible that they are alive somewhere. Then I received this." I handed him the letter signed Green Green. He held it close and read it slowly. "Do you know where the Isle of the Dead is?" he asked. "Yes, it's on a world I made." "You are going?" "Yes, I must." Green Green is, I believe, Gringrin Tharl of the city Dilpay. He hates you." "Why? I don't even know him." "That is unimportant. Your existence offends him, so naturally he wishes to be avenged for this affront. It is sad." "I'd say so, especially if he succeeds. But how has my existence served to offend him?" "You are the only alien to be a name-bearer. At one time it was thought that none but a paean could master the art you have learned, and not too many paeans are capable, of course. Gringrin undertook the study, and he completed it. He was to have been the 27th. He failed the final test, however." "The final test? I thought that one pretty much a matter of form." "No. It may have seemed so to you, but it is not. So after half a century of study with Delgrin of Dilpay, he was not confirmed in the trade. He was somewhat exercised. He spoke often of the fact that the last man to be admitted was not even paean. Then he departed Megapay. With his training, of course, he soon grew wealthy." "How long ago was that?" "Several 100 years, perhaps 6. "And you feel he's been hating me all this time and planning revenge?" "Yes. There was no great hurry, and a good piece of revenge requires elaborate preparation." It is always strange to hear a paean speak so. Eminently civilized, they nevertheless have made revenge a way of life. It is doubtless another of the reasons why there are so few paeans. Some of them actually keep vengeance books, long, elaborate lists of those who require a comeuppance, in order to keep track of everyone they intend to punish, complete with progress reports on the status of each vengeance scheme. A piece of vengeance isn't worth much to a paean unless it's complicated, carefully planned, and put into motion, and occurs with fiendish precision many years after the affront which stimulated it. It was explained to me that the fun of it is really in the planning and the anticipation. The actual death, madness, disfigurement, or humiliation which results is quite secondary to this. Marling once confided in me that he had had 3 going which had lasted over 1,000 years apiece, and that's no record. It's a way of life, really. It comforts one, providing a cheering object of contemplation when all other things are going poorly. It renders a certain satisfaction as the factors line themselves up, one by one, little triumphs, as it were, leading up to the time of fulfillment. And there is an aesthetic pleasure to be had, some even say a mystical experience, when the situation occurs and the carefully wrought boom is lowered. Children are taught the system at an early age, for full familiarity with it is necessary for attaining advanced old age. I had to learn it in a hurry, and was still weak on some of the finer points. "Have you any suggestions?" I asked. "Since it is useless to flee the vengeance of a paean," he told me, "I would recommend your locating him immediately and challenging him to a walk through the night of the soul. I will provide you with some fresh gluten roots before you leave." "Thank you. I'm not real up on that, you know." It is easy, and one of you will die thus solving your problems. So if he accepts, you will have nothing to worry about. Should you die, you will be avenged by my estate. Thank you, Dra. It is nothing. What of Bilion with respect to Gringrin? He is there. How so? They have made their own terms, those two. And? That is all I know. Will he see fit to walk with me, do you think? I do not know. Then, let us regard the waters in their rising, he said, and I turned and did so until he spoke again, perhaps half an hour later. This is all, he said. There is no more? No. The sky darkened until there were no sails. I could hear the sea, smell it, and there was its black, rolling, star-flecked bulk in the distance. I knew that soon an unseen bird would shriek, and one did. For a long while I stood in a pertinent corner of my mind, examining things I had left there a long time ago and forgotten, and some things which I had never fully understood. My big tree toppled, the Valley of Shadows faded, and the Isle of the Dead was only a hunk of rock dropped into the middle of the bay and sinking without a ripple. I was alone. I was absolutely alone. I knew what the next words that I would hear would be, and then, some time later, I heard them. "Journeying with me this night," he said. "Dra?" Nothing. Then, "Must it be this night?" I said. Nothing. "Where then will dwell Lorrimel of the many hands?" In the happy nothing, to come again, as always. "What of your debts, your enemies?" All of them paid. You had spoken of next year in the 5th season. That now is changed. I see. We will spend the night in converse. Earth-son, that I may give you my final secrets before sunrise. Sit down. And I did, at his feet, as in days far away through the smoke of memory seen, and younger by far. He began to speak, and I closed my eyes, listened. He knew what he was doing, knew what he wanted. This didn't keep me from being frightened as well as saddened, however. He had chosen me to be his guide, the last living thing that he would see. It was the highest honor he could pay a man, and I was not worthy of it. I hadn't used what he had given me as well as I might have. I'd screwed up a lot of things I shouldn't have. I knew he knew it, too. But it didn't matter. I was the one, which made him the only person in the whole galaxy able to remind me of my own father, dead these 1,000+ years. He had forgiven me my trespasses, the fear and the sadness. Why now? Why had he chosen this time? Because there might not be any other. In Marling's estimation, I was obviously off on a venture from which I would probably not be returning. This, therefore, would have to be our final encounter. "Every man I will go with thee and be thy guide, and thy most need to go by thy side." A good line for fear, though knowledge spoke it. They've a lot in common when you stop to consider it. And so the fear. We did not speak of the sadness either. It would not have been proper. We spoke for a time of the worlds we had made, of the places we had built and seen populated, of all the sciences that are involved in the feat of transforming rubble into a habitation, and, ultimately, we spoke of the art. The ecology game is more complicated than any chess game, goes beyond the best formulations of any computer. This is because, finally, the problems are aesthetic rather than scientific ones. All the thinking power within the 7-doored chamber of the skull is required, true, yet a dash of something still best described as inspiration is really the determining factor. We dwelled upon these inspirations, many of which now existed, and the night sea wind rose up so shrill and cold that I had to secure the windows against it and kindle a small fire, which blazed then like a holy thing in that oxygen-rich place. I can remember none of the words that were spoken that night. Only there, preserved within me, are the soundless pictures we shared, memory now, glazed over with distance and time. This is all, as he'd said, and after a while there was dawn. He fetched me the gluten roots when the faint fallstone occurred, sat for a time, and then we made the final preparations. About 3 hours later, I summoned the servants and ordered them to hire mourners and to send a party ahead into the mountains to open the family burial crypt. Using Marling's equipment, I sent formal messages to the other 25 names which lived, and to those he'd specified among friends, acquaintances, and relatives that he wished to be present. Then I prepared the ancient and dark green body he had worn, found my way down to the kitchen for breakfast, lit a cigar, and walked by the bright seaside where purple and yellow sails once more cut the horizon, found me a small tidal pool, sat down beside it, smoked. I was numb. That's the easiest way to put it. I had been there before, the place from which I had just returned, and as before I came away with a certain indecipherable scribbling upon my soul. I wished now for the sadness or the fear again, anything. But I felt nothing, not even anger. This would come later, though, I knew. But for the moment, I was too young or too old. Why did the day bloom so bright and the sea sparkle so before me? Why did the air burn salt and pleasant within me, and the life cries of the wood come like music into my ears? Nature is not so sympathetic as the poets would have you believe. Only other people sometimes care when you close your doors and do not open them again. I would stay in Megapay, 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 and listen to the litany of Loromel of the many hands, while the 1,000-year-old flutes covered it like a sheet, a statue. Then Shimbo would walk into the mountains once again, in procession with the others, and I, Francis Sandow, would see the opening of the cavern and gray charcoal black the closing of the crypt. I would stay a few days more to help order my master's affairs, and then depart upon my own journey. If it ended the same way, well, that's life. So much for night thoughts at mid-morning. I rose up and returned to the tower to wait. In the days that followed, Shimbo walked again. I remember the thunder as in a dream. There was thunder and flutes, and the fiery hieroglyphs of lightnings above the mountains beneath the clouds. This time nature wept, for Shimbo dragged the bell-pull. I recall the green and gray procession winding its way through the forest to the place where the timber broke and the dirt gave way to stone. As I walked, behind the creaking cart, the headgear of a name-bearer upon me, the singed shawl of mourning about my shoulders, I bore in my hands the mask of Loromel, a strip of dark cloth across the eyes. No more would his light burn in the shrines, unless another was given the name. I understand that it did burn for a moment, though, at the time of his passing in every shrine in the universe. Then the last door was closed, gray, charcoal, black. A strange dream, is it not? After it was all over, I sat in the tower for a week, as was expected of me. I fasted, and my thoughts were my own. During that week, a message came in from the Central Registration Unit via Home Free. I didn't read it until week's end, and when I did, I learned that Illyria was now owned by the Green Development Company. Before the day was over, I was able to ascertain locally that the Green Development Company was Gringrin Tharl, formerly of Dilpay, ex-student of Delgren of Dilpay, who bore the name Kleiss, out of whose mouth proceedeth rainbows. I called Delgren and made arrangements to see him the following afternoon. Then I broke my fast and I slept for a long, long time. There were no dreams that I can recall. Malisti had uncovered no one, nothing, on Driscoll. Delgren of Dilpay was of very little assistance, as he had not seen his former pupil for centuries. He hinted that he might be planning a surprise for Gringrin, should he ever return to Megapay. I wondered if the feeling and the plans were mutual. Whatever, these things no longer mattered. My time on Megapay had come to an end. I boosted the Model T into the sky and kept going until space and time ended for a space and a time. I continued. I anesthetized and cut open the middle finger of my left hand, implanted a laser crystal and some piezoelectric webbing, closed the incision and kept the hand in a healant unit for 4 hours. There was no scar. It would sting like hell and cost me some skin if I used it, but if I were to extend that finger, clench the others, and turn my palm upward, the beam it emitted would cut through a 2-foot slab of granite. I packed rations, medical supplies, food, gluten root in a light knapsack, which I cached near the port. I would not need a compass or maps, of course, but some fire sticks, a sheet of flimsy, a hand torch, and some night specs seemed advisable. I laid out everything I could think of, including my plans. I decided not to descend in the Model T, but to orbit and ride in on a non-metallic drift sled, and give myself an Illyrian week on the surface. I would instruct the T to descend at the end of that time and hover above the strongest power pull nexus, and then return once every day after that. I slept, I ate, I waited, I hated. Then one day there came a humming sound rising to a whine, then silence. The stars fell like fiery sleet, then froze all about me. Ahead there hung one bright one. I ascertained Illyria's position and moved toward a rendezvous. A couple lifetimes or days later, I regarded it, a little green opal of a world, with flashing seas and countless bays, inlets, lakes, fjords. Lush vegetation on the 3 tropical continents, cool woodlands, and numerous lakes on the 4 temperate ones. No really high mountains, but lots of hills. 9 small deserts, for variety's sake. 1 humpbacked river, half again the length of the Mississippi. A system of oceanic currents I was really proud of, and a 500-mile land bridge mountain range I had raised between 2 continents, just because geologists hate them as much as anthropologists love them. I watched a storm system develop near the equator, move northward, disperse its wet burden over the ocean. One by one, as I drew near, the 3 moons, Flopsus, Mopsus, and Cottontalis, partly eclipsed the world. I set the Model T into an enormous elliptical orbit, beyond the farthest moon, and hopefully also beyond the range of any detection devices. Then I set to work figuring the problem of the descents, my initial one and those later ones by the vessel itself. Then I checked my current position, set an alarm, and took a nap. When I awoke, I visited the latrine, checked the drift sled, went over my gear. I took an ultrasonic shower and dressed myself in black shirt and trousers of a water-repellent synthetic, the name of which I can never remember, even though I own the company. I put on what I call combat boots, but what everyone else calls hiking boots these days, and bloused the trousers up inside. Then I clasped on a soft leather belt with a dark 2-piece buckle, which could become the handles for the strangling wire that tore loose through the center seam. I hung a pistol belt over that to hold a laser handgun at my right hip, and I hooked a row of small grenades along the back. I wore a pendant around my neck with a spit bomb inside, and on my right wrist I strapped a chrono set for Illyria and gimmick to spray paragas from 9 o'clock when the stem was pulled. A handkerchief, a comb, and the remains of a 1,000-year-old rabbit's foot went into my pockets. I was ready. I had to wait, though. I wanted to descend at night, drifting down like thistledown, but black, onto the continent Splendida, going to ground no closer than 100, no further than 300 miles from my destination. I wriggled into the knapsack, smoked a cigarette, and worked my way back to the sled chamber. I sealed it off and boarded the sled. I pulled shut the half-bubble, locked it about me, felt a tiny jet of air just above my head, a small wave of warmth just about my feet. I pushed the button that raised the hatch. The wall opened, and I stared down at the crescent moon my world had become. The T would launch me at the proper moment. The sled would break itself at the right time. I had only to control the drift once I'd entered the atmosphere. The sled and I together would weigh only a few pounds because of the anti-grav elements in the hull. It had rudders, ailerons, stabilizers, also sails and chutes. It's less like a glider than one assumes on first hearing of it. It's more like a sailboat for use on a 3-dimensional ocean. And I waited in it and looked down at the wave of night washing day from Illyria. Mopsus moved into view. Cottontalis moved out of it. My right ankle began to itch. As I was scratching it, a blue light came on above my head. As I fastened my belts, it went out, and the red one came on. As I relaxed, the buzzer sounded and the red light went out, and a mule kicked me in the backside, and there were stars all about, dark Illyria before me, and no hatch to frame them. Then, drifting, not down, but ahead, not falling, just moving, and even that undetectable when I closed my eyes. The world was a pit, a dark hole. Slowly it grew. The warmth had filled the capsule, and the only sounds were my heart, my breath, the air jet. When I turned my head, I could not see the Model T. Good. It had been years since I had used a drift sled for purposes other than recreation, and each time I had, like now, my mind skipped back to a pre-dawn sky and the rocking of the sea and the smell of sweat and the bitter aftertaste of Dramamine in my throat, and the first thud of artillery fire as the landing vehicle neared the beach. Then, as now, I'd wiped my palms on my knees, reached into my left side pocket, and touched the dead bunny's foot there. Funny. My brother had had one, too. He would have enjoyed the drift sled. He'd liked airplanes and gliders and boats. He'd liked water skiing and skin diving and acrobatics and aerobatics. That's why he'd gone airborne, which is probably why he got it, too. You can only expect so much from one lousy rabbit's foot. The stars blazed like the love of God, cold and distant, as soon as I dropped the black spot on the bubble and blocked out the light of the sun. Mopsus caught the light, though, and cast it down into the pit. She held the middle orbit. Flopsus was nearest the planet, but was on the other side just then. The three made for generally tranquil seas, and once in a score or so of years they put on a magnificent tidal display when all of them were in conjunction. Isles of coral would appear in sudden deserts of purple and orange, as the waters rolled back, humped up, became a green mountain, moved round the world. And stones and bones and fishes and driftwood would lie like the footprints of Proteus, and the winds would follow, and the temperature shifts, the inversions, the fields in the clouds, the cathedrals in the sky. And then the rains would come, and the wet mountains would break themselves upon the land, as the fairy cities shattered and the magic isles returned to the depths, and Proteus, God knows where, would laugh like thunder, as with each bright flash Neptune's white-hot trident dipped, sizzled, dipped, sizzled. Afterwards you'd rub your eyes. Now Illyria was moonbeams over cheesecloth. Somewhere in her sleep a cat-like creature would stir soon. She would awaken, stretch, rise, and begin to prowl. After a time she would stare at the sky for a moment, at the moon, beyond the moon. Then a murmur would run through the valleys, and the leaves would move upon the trees. They would feel it. Born of my nervous system, fractioned from my own DNA, shaped in the initial cell by the unassisted power of my mind, they would feel it, all of them. Anticipation. Yes, my children, I am coming, for Belian has dared to walk among you. Drifting. If only it had been a man there on Illyria waiting for me, it would have been easy. As it was, I felt that my armaments were mainly trappings. If it had only been a man, though, I wouldn't even have bothered with them. But Green was not a man. He was not even a paean, which in itself is a frightening thing to be. Rather, he was something more than either. He bore a name, albeit improperly, and name-bearers can influence living things, even the elements about them, when they raise up and merge with the shadow that lies behind the name. I am not getting theological. I've heard some scientific-sounding explanations for everything involved, if you'll buy voluntary schizophrenia along with a God complex and extrasensory faculties. Take them one at a time, and bear in mind the number of years' training a worldscaper undergoes, and the number of candidates who complete it. I had the edge on Green, I felt, because it was my world he'd chosen for the encounter. How long he'd had to fool around with it, of course, was a thing I didn't know, and a thing that worried me. What changes had he effected? He'd chosen the perfect bait. How perfect was the trap? How much of an edge did he think he had? Whatever. You couldn't be sure of anything, not against another name. Nor, of course, could I. Did you ever witness the combat of beta splendens, the Siamese fighting fish? It's not like a cockfight or a dogfight or a cobra mongoose match or anything else in the world but itself. You place two males in the same bowl. They move together quickly, unfurling their brilliant fins like red, blue, green shadows, expanding their branchial membranes. This gives the illusion of their suddenly blooming into something larger than they had been. Then they approach one another slowly, remain side by side for perhaps a quarter of a minute, drifting. Then they move, so fast that the eye can't even follow what is happening. Then, slow and peaceful again, they drift. Then, suddenly, the colored whirligig. Then drifting, then movement. This pattern continues. The colored shadow fins. And even this may be misleading. After a time, a reddish haze will surround them. Another flurry. They slow. Their jaws are locked. A minute passes, perhaps two. One opens his jaws and swims away. The other drifts. This is how I saw what was to come. I passed the moon. The dark bulk of the world grew before me, occluding stars. As I neared it, my descent slowed. Devices beneath the cockpit were activated, and when I finally entered the upper atmosphere, I was already drifting, slowly. The impression of moonlight on 100 lakes, coins at a dark pool's bottom. I monitored for artificial light, detected none. Flopsus appeared upon the horizon, adding her light to her sister's. After perhaps half an hour, I could make out the more prominent features of the continent. I combined these with memory and feeling, and began to steer the sled. Like the falling of a leaf on a still day, tacking, side-slipping, I headed for the ground. The lake called Acheron, with its Isle of the Dead, lay, I calculated, some 600 miles to the northwest. Far below me, clouds appeared. I drifted on, and they were gone. I lost very little altitude during the next half hour and gained perhaps 40 miles on my goal. I wondered what detection devices might be functioning below me. The high-altitude winds caught me, and I fought them for a time. Finally, though, I had to descend to several thousand feet to escape the worst of them. For the next several hours, I made my way steadily north and west. At a height of some 50,000 feet, I was still over 400 miles from my goal. I wondered what detection devices might be functioning below me. Within the next hour, though, I descended 20,000 feet and gained about 70 miles. Things seemed to be breaking nicely. Finally, a false dawn began in the east, and I dropped a mile to get beneath it. My speed increased as I did so. It was like descending into an ocean, light water to dark. But the light followed me. After a time, I ran again. I plowed through a cloud bank, estimated my position, continued to descend. How many miles to Acheron? 200, perhaps. The light caught me, passed me, went away. I dropped to 15,000 feet, picked up 40 miles. I deactivated several more plates. I was cruising at 3,000 feet when the real dawn began to occur. I continued for 10 minutes, dropping, found a clear place, and went to ground. The sun cracked open the east, and I was 100 miles from Acheron, give or take around 10. I opened the bubble, pulled the distract cord, leaped to the ground, and ran. A minute later, the sled collapsed upon itself and began to smolder. I slowed to a walk, took my bearings, headed across the field toward the place where the trees began. Chapter 5. During the first 5 minutes, Illyria returned to me, and it was as if I had never been gone. Filtered through the forest's mists, the sunlight came, rose and amber. Dewdrops glistened on the leaves and the grasses. The air was cool, smelled of damp earth and decomposing vegetation, which is sweet. A small yellow bird circled my head, lighted on my shoulder, perched there for a dozen paces, was gone. I stopped to cut myself a walking stick, and the smell of the white wood took me back to Ohio and the creek where I'd cut willows to fashion whistles, soaking the wands overnight, tapping the bark with the handle of my knife to loosen it, near the place where the strawberries grew. And I found some wild berries, huge and purple, crushed them between my fingers and licked the juice, which was tart. The crested lizard, bright as a tomato, stirred sluggishly atop his rock and moved to sit on the toe of my boot as I was doing this. I touched his crown, then pushed him away and moved on. When I looked back, his salt and pepper eyes met my own. I walked beneath 40 and 50-foot trees, and moisture occasionally dripped down upon me. Birds began to awaken, and insects. A big-bellied green whistler began his 10-minute song of deflation on a limb above me. Somewhere to my left, a friend or relative joined in. 6 purple cobra de capella flowers exploded from the ground and emitted hisses as they swayed upon their stalks, their petals rippling like flags, their heavy perfumes released with bomb-like efficiency. But I wasn't startled, for it was as if I had never gone away. I walked on, and the grasses diminished. The trees were larger now, ranging from 50 to 70 feet, with numerous boulders lying among them. A good place for an ambush. Likewise, a good place to take cover from one. The shadows were deep, and paramonkeys chanted overhead, while a legion of clouds advanced from the west. The low sun tickled their quarters with flame, shot shafts of light through the leaves. Vines that clung to some of the giants held blossoms like silver candelabra, and the air about them hinted of temples and incense. I forded a pearly stream, and crested water snakes swam beside me, hooting like owls. They were quite poisonous, but very friendly. From the other bank, the ground began to slope upward gently at first, and as I advanced, some subtle change seemed to come over the world. There was nothing objective to which I could relate it, only a feeling that the decks of order had been slightly riffled. The coolness of morning in the wood did not depart as the day advanced. Rather, it seemed to deepen. There was a definite chill in the air, and later it became an almost clammy feeling. Still, the sky was more than half filled with clouds by then, and the ionization that precedes a storm often gives rise to such feelings. When I stopped to eat, sitting with my back against the bole of an ancient mark tree, I frightened a pandrilla who had been digging among its roots. As soon as he began to flee, I knew that something was wrong. I filled my mind with a desire that he return and laid it upon him. He halted then in his flight, and turned and regarded me. Slowly he approached. I fed him a cracker and tried to see through his eyes as he ate it. Fear, recognition, fear. There had been a moment of misplaced panic. It didn't be long. I released him, and he remained content to eat my crackers. His initial response had been too unusual to dismiss, however. I feared what it indicated. I was entering enemy territory. I finished eating and moved on. I descended into a foggy vale, and when I left it the mists were still with me. The sky was almost completely overcast. Small animals fled before me, and I made no effort to change their minds. I walked on, and my breath was white, moist wings now. I avoided 2 power poles. If I were to use one, it could betray my position to another sensitive. What is a power pole? Well, it's a part of the makeup of everything with an electromagnetic field. Every world has numerous shifting points in its gravitational matrix. There, certain machines or especially talented people can plug in and act as switchboards, batteries, condensers. Power pole is a handy term for such a nexus of energy, a term used by people who can employ it in such a fashion. I didn't want to use one until I was certain as to the nature of the enemy, however, for all name-bearers normally possess this capability. So I let the fog dampen my garments and take the sheen from my boot tops, when I could have dried out. I walked with my staff in my left hand, my right one free to draw and fire. Nothing attacked me, though, as I advanced. In fact, after a time, no living thing crossed my path. I hiked until evening, making perhaps 20 miles that day. The dampness was all-pervasive, but there was no rain. I located a small cave in the foothills I was then negotiating, cast my flimsy, a 10-by-10 sheet of tough plastic material, 3 molecules in thickness, for insulation against the dirt and some of the dampness, ate a dry meal, and slept, my gun near my hand. The morning was as bleak as the night and the day before, and the fog had thickened. I suspected an intent behind it, and I moved cautiously. It struck me as just a bit too melodramatic. If he thought he was going to shake me up with shadow, mist, chill, and the alienation of a few of my creatures, he was wrong. Discomfort just irritates me, makes me angry, and fixes my determination to get at its source and deal with it as quickly as possible. I slopped my way through much of the second day, topped the hills, and began my downward trek. It was along about evening that I picked up a companion. A light appeared off to my left, and moved parallel to my own course. It hovered anywhere from 2 to 8 feet above the ground, and its color varied from pale yellow through orange to white. It could have been anywhere from 20 to 100 feet away at any given time. Occasionally it disappeared, always it returned. A will-o'-the-wisp, sent to lure me into some crevasse or marshy bog? Probably. Still, I was curious. I admired its persistence, and it was nice to have company. "Good evening," I said. "I'm coming to kill whoever sent you, you know." "But then you might just be marsh gas," I added, "in which case you may dismiss my last remark." "Either way," I went on, "I'm not in the mood to be led astray just now. You can take a coffee break if you'd like." Then I began whistling "It's a Long Way to Tipperary." The thing continued to pace me. I stopped and sheltered beneath a tree to light a cigarette. I stood there and smoked it. The light hovered about 50 feet away, as if waiting. I tried to touch it with my mind, but it was as if there was nothing there. I drew my gun and thought better of it, reholstered it. I finished my cigarette, crushed it out, moved ahead. Again, the light moved with me. About an hour later, I made camp in a small clearing. I wrapped myself in my flimsy, my back against a rock. I built a small fire and heated some soup I'd brought along. The light wouldn't carry far on a night like this. The will-o'-the-wisp hovered just outside the circle of firelight. "Care for a cup of coffee?" I asked it. There was no reply, which was a good thing. I had only one cup with me. After I finished eating, I lit a cigar and let the fire go down to embers. I puffed my cigar and wished for stars. The night was soundless about me, and the chill was reaching for my backbone. It had already seized my toes and was gnawing on them. I wished I'd thought to bring a flask of brandy. My fellow traveler stood vigil, unmoving, and I stared back at him. If it wasn't a natural phenomenon, it was there to spy on me. Dared I sleep? I dared. When I awoke, my chrono showed me that an hour and a quarter had passed. Nothing had changed. Not 40 minutes later either, nor 2 hours and 10 minutes after that when I awoke again. I slept out the rest of the night and found it waiting in the morning. This day was like the previous one, cold and blank. I broke camp and moved on, reckoning that I was about a third of the way to my destination. Suddenly there was a new development. My companion moved from my left and drifted slowly ahead. It turned right then and hovered about 60 feet before me. By the time I reached that spot, it had moved on, anticipating my path. That was a thing I didn't like. It was as though the guiding intelligence were mocking me, saying, "Look here, old boy, I know where you're headed and how you intend getting there. Why don't you let me make the way a bit easier?" It was a successful mock, too, for it made me feel like a complete fool. There were several things I could do about it, but I didn't feel like doing them yet. So I followed. I followed till lunchtime, when it politely halted until I was quite finished, till dinner time, when it did the same. Shortly thereafter, however, the light again changed its behavior. It drifted off to the left and vanished. I stopped and stood still for a moment, for I'd grown used to it. Was I supposed to have become so conditioned to following it all day that fatigue and habit would combine to lead me after it now off my intended path? Perhaps. I wondered how far it would lead me if I gave it the opportunity. I decided that 20 minutes of walking after it would be quite enough. I loosened my pistol in its holster and waited for it to come again. It did. When it repeated its previous performances, I turned and followed. It hurried ahead, waited for me to catch up, hurried on. After about 5 minutes, a light rain began to fall. Though the darkness deepened, I could see without using my hand torch. I looked all the way through. I cursed and sloughed along, shivering. Approximately half a mile further along, wetter, colder, darker the day, stronger still the feeling of alienation, I was left alone. The light went out. I waited, but it did not return. Carefully, I made my way to the place where I had last seen it, circling in from the right, gun in hand, searching with my eyes and my mind. I brushed against a dry tree limb and heard it snap. "Stop, for the love of God, don't!" I threw myself to the ground and rolled. The cry had come from right beside me. I covered that area from a distance of 12 feet. Cry? Had it been a truly physical sound or something within my mind? I wasn't certain. I waited. Then, so softly that I wasn't certain how I was hearing it, there came to me a sound of sobbing. Soft sounds are difficult to pinpoint, and this was no exception. I turned my head slowly from right to left, saw no one. "Who is it?" I asked in a shrill whisper, for these too are without direction. No answer, but the sobbing continued. Reaching out with my mind, I felt pain and confusion, nothing more. "Who is it?" I repeated. There was silence then. "Frank?" said the voice. This time I decided to wait. I let a minute go by, then said my name. "Help me," came the reply. "Who are you? Where are you?" "Here." And the answers came into my mind, and the nape of my neck crawled and my hand tightened on the pistol. Dango, the capel knife. I knew then what had happened, but I didn't have guts enough to turn on my torch and take a good look. I didn't need to, though. My will-o'-the-wisp chose that moment to return. It drifted past me, rose higher. higher brightness, increasing in intensity to a level far beyond anything it had exhibited earlier. It hovered at a height of 15 or 20 feet and blazed like a flare. Below it stood Dango. He had no choice but to stand. He was rooted to the spot. His lean, triangular face bore a long black beard and flowing hair that twined away among his limbs, his leaves. His eyes were dark and sunken and wretched. The bark that was a part of him bore insect holes, bird droppings, and char marks of numerous small fires about the base. I saw then that blood dripped from the limb I had broken as I passed him by. I rose slowly. "Dango," I said. "They're gnawing at my feet," he told me. "I'm sorry." I lowered the gun, almost dropped it. "Why didn't he let me stay dead?" "Because once you were my friend, and then you were my enemy," I said. "You knew me well." "Because of you?" The tree swayed as if reaching after me. He began to curse me, and I stood there and listened as the rain mingled with his blood and soaked into the ground. We had been partners in a joint venture one time, and he'd tried to cheat me. I brought charges. He was acquitted and tried to kill me afterwards. I put him in the hospital, back on Earth, and he died in an auto accident a week after his discharge. He would have killed me if he'd gotten the chance. With a knife, I know. But I never gave him the chance. You might sort of say I helped his bad luck along when it came to the accident. I knew he'd never rest until he'd nailed me or was dead, and I didn't feel like getting nailed. The raking light made his features look ghastly. He had the complexion of a mushroom and the eyes of an evil cat. His teeth were broken, and there was a festering sore on his left cheek. The back of his head was joined with the tree. His shoulders merged with it, and there were two branches which might contain his arms. From the waist down, he was tree. "Who did it?" I asked. "The big green bastard. Payan," he said. "Suddenly I was here. I don't understand. There was an accident." "I'll get him," I said. "I'm going after him now. I'm going to kill him. Then I'll get you out." "No, don't go." "It's the only way, Dango." "You don't understand what it's like," he said. "I can't wait. Please." "It may only take a few days, Dango. And he may get you instead. Then it'll be never. Christ, how it hurts. I'm sorry about that deal, Frank. Believe me, please." I looked down at the ground and up at the light. I raised the gun and lowered it. "I can't kill you any more," I said. He bit his lip, and the blood ran down his chin and into his beard, and the tears came out of his eyes. I looked away from his eyes. I stumbled backwards and began mumbling in Payan. Only then did I realize I was near a power pole. I could feel it suddenly. And I grew taller and taller, and Frank Sandow grew smaller and smaller, and when I shrugged, the thunders rumbled. When I raised my left hand, they roared. When I drew it down to my shoulder, the flash that followed blinded me, and the shock raised my hair upon my head. I was alone with the smells of ozone and smoke, there, before the charred and splintered thing that had been Dango, the knife. Even the will-o'-the-wisp was gone now. The rain came down in torrents and laid the smells to rest. I staggered back in the direction from which I had come, my boots making sucking sounds in the mud, my clothes trying to crawl under my skin. Somehow, somewhere, I don't remember exactly, I slept. Of all the things a man may do, sleep probably contributes most to keeping him sane. It puts brackets about each day. If you do something foolish or painful today, you get irritated if somebody mentions it today. If it happened yesterday, though, you can nod or chuckle, as the case may be. You've crossed through nothingness or dream to another island in time. How many memories can be summoned up in a single instant? Many, it would seem. Actually, though, they're only a small fraction of those which exist somewhere. And the longer you've been around, the more of them you have. So once I have slept, there are many things which come to aid me when I wish to anesthetize a particular occurrence. This may sound callous. It is not. I do not mean that I live without pain for things gone by, without guilt. I mean that over the centuries I have developed a mental reflex. When I have been swamped emotionally, I sleep. When I awaken, thoughts of other days come forth, fill my head. After a time, memory, the vulture, circles closer and closer, then descends upon the thing of pain. It dismembers it, gorges itself upon it, digests it with the past standing to witness. I suppose it is a thing called perspective. I have seen many persons die, in many fashions. I have never been unmoved. But sleep gives memory a chance to rev its engine and hand me back my head each day. For I have also seen people live. I have looked upon the colors of joy, sorrow, love, hate, satiation, peace. I found her in the mountains one morning, miles from anywhere, and her lips were blue and her fingers were frostbitten. She was wearing a tiger-striped pair of leotards, and she was curled into a ball beside a scrubby little bush. I put my jacket around her and left my mineral bag and my tools on a rock, and I never did recover them. She was delirious, and it seemed I heard her say the name Noel several times while I was carrying her back to my vehicle. She had some bad bruises and a lot of minor cuts and abrasions. I took her to a clinic where they treated her and kept her overnight. The following morning I went to see her and learned that she'd refused to supply her identity. Also, she seemed unable to supply any money. So I paid her bill and asked her what she was going to do, and she didn't know that either. I offered to put her up at the cottage I was renting, and she accepted. For the first week, it was like living in a haunted house. She never talked unless I asked her a question. She prepared meals for me and kept the place clean and spent the rest of the time in her room with the door closed. The second week, she heard me picking at an old mandolin, the first time I'd touched the thing in months, and she came out and sat across the living room from me and listened. So I kept playing, for hours longer than I'd intended, just to keep her there, because it was the only thing in over a week that had evoked any sort of response. When I laid it aside, she asked me if she could try it, and I nodded. She crossed the room, picked it up, bent over, and began to play. She was far from a virtuoso, but then so was I. I listened and brought her a cup of coffee, said good night, and that was it. The next day, though, she was a different person. She'd combed the tangles out of her dark hair and trimmed it. Much of the puffiness was gone from beneath her pale eyes. She talked to me at breakfast about everything from the weather, the news reports, my mineral collection, music, antiques to exotic fishes. Everything excepting herself. I took her places after that. Restaurants, shows, the beach, everywhere but the mountains. About 4 months went by like this. Then one day I realized I was beginning to fall in love with her. Of course I didn't mention it, though she must have seen it. Hell, I didn't really know anything about her, and I felt awkward. She might have a husband and 6 kids somewhere. She asked me to take her dancing. I did, and we danced on a terrace under the stars until they closed the place down around 4 in the morning. The next day, when I rose at the crack of noon, I was alone. On the kitchen table there was a note that said, "Thank you. Please do not look for me. I have to go back now. I love you." It was, of course, unsigned, and that's all I know about the girl without a name. When I was around 15 years old, I found a baby starling beneath a tree while I was mowing the lawn in our backyard. Both its legs were broken. At least I surmised this because they stuck out at funny angles from its body, and it sat on its backside with its tail feathers bent way up. When I crossed its field of vision, it threw its head back and opened its beak. I bent down and saw that there were ants all over, so I picked it up and brushed them off. Then I looked for a place to put it. I decided on a bushel basket lined with freshly cut grass. I set the thing on our picnic table on the patio under the maple trees. I tried an eyedropper to get some milk down its throat, but it just seemed to choke on it. I went back to mowing the lawn. Later that day I looked in on it, and there were 5 or 6 big black beetles down in the grass with it. Disgusted, I threw them out. The next morning, when I went out with milk and an eyedropper, there were more beetles. I cleaned house once again. Later that day, I saw a huge, dark bird perched on the edge of the basket. She went down inside, and after a moment flew away. I kept watching, and she returned 3 times within the half hour. Then I went out and looked into the basket and saw more beetles. I realized that she'd been hunting them, bringing them to it, trying to feed it. It wasn't able to eat, however, so she just left them there in the basket. That night a cat found it. There were only a few feathers and some blood among the beetles when I went out with my eyedropper and some milk the next morning. There is a place. It is a place where broken rocks ring a red sun. Several centuries ago we discovered a race of arthropod-like creatures called Huiles, with whom we could not deal. They rejected friendly overtures on the parts of every known intelligent race. Also, they slew our emissaries and sent their remains back to us, missing a few pieces here and there. When first we contacted them, they possessed vehicles for travel within their own solar system. Shortly thereafter, they developed interstellar travel. Wherever they went, they killed and they stole and then beat it back home. Perhaps they didn't realize the size of the interstellar community at that time, or perhaps they didn't care. They guessed right if they thought it would take an awfully long time to reach an accord when it came to declaring war on them. There is actually very little precedent for interstellar war. The Payans are about the only ones who remember any. So the attacks failed. What remained of our forces were withdrawn, and we began to bombard the planet. The Huiles were, however, further along technologically than we'd initially thought. They had a near-perfect defense system against missiles. So we withdrew and tried to contain them. They didn't stop their raids, though. Then the names were contacted, and 3 worldscapers, Sangring of Grelday, Karth Ting of Morday, and I, were chosen by a lot to use our abilities in reverse. Later, within the system of the Huiles, beyond the orbit of their homeworld, a belt of asteroids began to collapse upon itself, forming a planetoid. Rock by rock it grew, and slowly it altered its course. We sat with our machinery beyond the orbit of the farthest planet, directing the new world's growth and its slow spiral inward. When the Huiles realized what was happening, they tried to destroy it, but it was too late. They never asked for mercy, and none of them tried to flee. They waited, and the day came. The orbits of the 2 worlds intersected, and now it is a place where broken rocks ring a red sun. I stayed drunk for a week after that. Once I collapsed in a desert while trying to walk from my damaged vehicle to a small outpost of civilization. I had been walking for 4 days without water for 2, and my throat felt like sandpaper and my feet were 1,000,000 miles away. I passed out. How long I lay there I do not know, perhaps an entire day. Then what I thought to be a product of delirium came and crouched beside me. It was purplish in color, with a ruff around its neck and 3 horny knobs on its lizard-like face. It was about 4 feet in length and scaly. It had a short tail, and there were claws on each of its digits. Its eyes were dark ellipses with nictitating membranes. It carried a long, hollow reed and a small pouch. I still don't know what it was. It regarded me for a few moments, then dashed away. I rolled onto my side and watched it. It poked the reed into the ground and held its mouth over the end, then withdrew the reed, moved on, and repeated the activity. About the 11th time it did it, its cheeks began to bulge like balloons. Then it ran to my side, leaving the reed in place, and it touched my mouth with its forelimb. I guessed what it was trying to indicate, and I opened my mouth. Leaning close, slowly, carefully, so as not to waste a drop, it trickled the hot, dirty water from its mouth into my own. 6 times it returned to the reed and brought back water, giving it to me in this fashion. Then I passed out again. When I awakened, it was evening, and the creature brought me more water. In the morning I was able to walk to the tube, crouch beside it, and draw my fill of liquid. The creature awakened slowly, sluggish in the pre-dawn cold. When it had come around, I took off my chrono and my hunting knife, and I emptied my pockets of money and placed these things before it. It studied the items. I pushed them toward it and pointed at the pouch it bore. It pushed them back toward me and made a clicking sound with its tongue. So I touched its forelimb and said thanks in every language that I knew, picked up my stuff, and started walking again. I made it into the settlement the following afternoon. A girl, a bird, a world, a drink of water, and Dango the knife riven from head to foot. The cycles of recollection place pain beside thought, sight, sentiment, and the always who, what, why. Sleep, the conductor of memory, keeps me sane. More than this I do not know, really. But I did not think I was callous by arising the following morning more intent upon what lay before me than behind. What it was 50 to 60 miles of progressively difficult terrain. The ground was rockier, drier. Leaves possessed sharp, serrate edges. The trees were different. The animals were different from what I had left behind. There were parodies of the things in which I had taken such pride. My midnight warblers here emitted harsh croaking sounds. The insects all had stings, and the flowers stank. There were no straight, tall trees. There were all of them twisted or squat. My gazelle-like leogas were cripples. Smaller animals snarled at me and ran. Some of the larger ones had to be stared down. My ears cracked with the increasing altitude, and the fog was still with me, but I pushed on steadily, and I made perhaps 25 miles that day. 2 more days, I figured, perhaps less, and one to do the job. That night I was awakened by one of the most god-awful explosions I'd heard in years. I sat up and listened to the echoes, or perhaps it was only the ringing in my ears. I sat there with my gun in my hand and waited beneath a large, old tree. In the northwest, despite the fog, I could see a light. It was a sort of generalized orange glow. It began to spread. The second explosion was not so loud as the first. Neither was the third or the fourth. By then, however, I had other things to think about. The ground was trembling beneath me. I stayed where I was and waited. The shocks increased in intensity. Judging from the sky, a quarter of the world was on fire. Since there wasn't much I could do about it at the moment, I reholstered my pistol, sat with my back against the tree, and lit a cigarette. Something seemed out of whack. Green was sure as hell going to a lot of trouble to impress me, when he should have known I wasn't that impressionable. That kind of activity could not be natural in this region, and he was the only one other than myself who was on the scene and able to do it. Why? Was he just saying, "Look, I'm tearing up your world, Sandow. What are you going to do about it?" Was he demonstrating the power of Belion with hopes of frightening me? I toyed for a moment with the notion of seeking out a power pole and unleashing the worst electrical storm he'd ever seen over the entire area, just to show him how impressed I was, but I shelved the idea quickly. I did not want to fight him from a distance. I wanted to meet him face to face and tell him what I thought of him. I wanted to confront him and show myself to him and ask him why he was being such a bloody fool, why my being a homo sap had aroused such a hatred that he'd gone to such lengths to hurt me. He obviously knew I had already arrived, was there on the world somewhere, else there would have been no will-o'-the-wisp to take me to Dango. So I betrayed nothing by what I did next. I closed my eyes and bowed my head and summoned up the power. I tried to picture him somewhere near the Isle of the Dead, a gloating paean, watching his volcano rise, watching the ashes spew forth like black leaves, watching the lava glow and boil, watching the snakes of sulfur crawl through the heavens, and with the full power of my hatred behind it, I sent forth the message. Patience, Green. Patience, Grin, Tharl. Patience. In but a few days I will be with you for a short time. A short time only. There was no reply, but then I hadn't expected one. The going was rougher. A black snowfall of ashes descended through the mist. There was still an occasional tumbler, and animals fled past me, heading in the opposite direction. They ignored me completely, and I tried to ignore them. End of Side 2. To continue, change side selector switch and turn the cassette over.